Thank you, Kathy, for that kind introduction. This morning we're going to enjoy a healthy discussion about how to take this policy framework, this market situation, and stimulate the development of housing, which is the type people need, at the price people can afford. We're also going to explore how better to use the existing housing stock. We have three excellent panelists who will each make presentations. I'm going to ask all three of them to come up at this point. Joining me on stage is Nancy Taylor, Commissioner of Finance and Treasurer for the Regional Municipality of Durham, and Jody Johnson, Acting Director of Legal Services in the Legislative and Planning Services in the Division of Halton Region. And our first speaker, Joe Vaccaro. Joe is the Chief Executive Officer of the Ontario Home Builders Association. As CEO, Joe oversees operations of the Ontario-wide organization, which is comprised of 4,000 member companies organized into 29 local associations that represents professionals within new home and renovation industry. OHBA is focused on improving new housing supply, choice, and more affordable options for Ontario's home believers and renovation consumers by positively impacting provincial legislation, regulation, and policies that affect the industry. While earning a degree in political science and philosophy, that's an interesting conversation, Joe, Vaccaro spent his summers in the family residential construction business, framing new homes across the GTA. Following his graduation, Vaccaro served as senior advisor and assistant to the Ministers of Economic Development and Trade, chair of the Management Board, and the Minister of Government Services. From swinging a hammer to running political campaigns to advocating for the association policies, Vaccaro is a home builder champion and has a unique industry perspective. So I would ask Joe to come forward and address us.
Good morning, everyone. I want to begin by thanking AMO for having me here today. I've been to this conference for 15 years, and this year was, I think, more interesting than ever because of the work done around the Housing Supply Action Plan. So thank you for having me. Let me start with a campaign that we've been running through the Ontario Home Builders Association for the last little while, the Home Believer campaign, a social media campaign really focused on the issues of choice and supply. That choice includes ownership, rental, retirement communities, co-op housing, and that supply includes high-rise, low-rise, mid-rise, laneway to tiny homes, the whole spectrum of housing options. The challenge here is to focus on providing solutions, and our view is the solution is always going to be more supply and choice across Ontario. The demand is real out there. Let me give you some additional statistics. From 2003 to 2019, the province of Ontario grew from 12.2 million people in 2003 to 14.5 million people in 2019. 2.3 million new people made Ontario their home. In the Greater Golden Horseshoe specifically, in 2001 we had 7.5 million people. 2016, 9.2 million people, a growth of 1.7 million people. Again, making Ontario their home. I say this because I think we spend a lot of time talking about supply, but we have to understand the context is growth. People are coming here for all the reasons that we celebrate as Canadians and as residents. The forecast moving forward is the cornerstone of, I think, the work that needs to be done at the municipal level, provincial level, and even at the federal level. So if you look at the population growth numbers provided by the ministry through the growth plan, you'll see that the projection is for Ontario to grow by 2.6 million more home believers by 2031. What that means is that we need 1 million more homes to meet this demand. That is the elephant in the room. We talk about supply, types of housing, type of ownership, but the reality is in your communities, you are seeing this growth. People are coming here. So focusing on solutions to this reality, I think is the cornerstone of what we do for the next 10 to 12 years. So we commissioned some polling information in the last few weeks to really assess how people feel about housing and the housing issues in Ontario. None of this will be a surprise to anyone in this room. At a high level, what we learned was that 70% of people polled agreed we need to build more housing. Almost 70% agreed we need to provide more housing choice in the marketplace. Almost 90% believe owning a home should be within reach of most Canadians. And over 65% think governments, provincial and municipal, can do more to get housing built across Ontario. Again, none of us should be surprised by this information. But I think what it does is it reaffirms that people are looking at housing, concerned about housing, engaged in housing. Why am I sharing this information? For many of the municipally elected officials in this room, this is not news. Housing supply, housing choice, housing affordability were the top issue in the provincial campaign, were the top issue in many municipal campaigns. You heard it in your communities, on the doorsteps, in your neighborhoods. So the question becomes, how do we take this opportunity? Because that's how you should look at it. There's an opportunity here, working in a growth environment. How do we take this opportunity, and what do we need to do from a legislative standpoint, a municipal standpoint, a community standpoint, to respond? Does Bill 108 and the Housing Supply Action Plan, do we at OHPA believe it will turn those home believer dreams into reality? Does it provide a legislative framework and a direction, building on smart growth brought forward by the PC government in 2000, the growth plan brought forward by the Liberal government in 2003? Does it have a focused response to the demand issue, to that elephant in that room? We say yes. We say yes because I think it brings together where we've been, the challenges that we've all shared, and the reality of responding to that demand. So I'll end with this point. Housing requires a partnership. It requires collaboration, cooperation. We have a real demand to respond to. We have real needs to respond to. And we have a real opportunity in front of us. I'm often reminded of this from my grandmother. She always used to say, there are two types of people. There are problem staters and problem solvers. I know I'm in a room full of problem solvers. Working together, we can respond to this situation in a positive way. Thank you for your time.
Thank you, Joe. Nancy Taylor is the Commissioner of Finance and Treasurer of the Regional Municipality of Durham. Nancy is a chartered professional accountant and has over 26 years of municipal government experience, both local and at the upper tier level. She has served as president of the Municipal Finance Officers Association, as well as been the chair of the Durham Municipal Insurance Pool. Nancy has spent her career in high growth municipalities and implemented a number of development charges background studies. Welcome, Nancy.
Thank you very much for the opportunity to present today. I'm reminded that I have 10 minutes and I'm doing some very technical things, so I will try to do my best to work my way through those, but I'm happy to answer any questions after the session is over. I'd like to take a minute to thank Municipal Finance Officers Association for their insights into my presentation today. My focus is on the financial implications that may need to be considered when you're providing input into consultations that are available and continue into the fall. I'd like to say that the municipal finance sector is adaptable and creative when it comes to accommodating major changes. Our objective is to ensure that all impacts of proposed changes are considered and deliberate as we move forward. As you're all aware, development charges are the primary tool to fund growth-related capital. Development charges are not revenue generators for municipalities, but rather cost recovery mechanisms to ensure that infrastructure is in place to service growth. You can see in the chart the magnitude of development charge cash flows over the past several years. Without those cash flows, infrastructure cannot be built, new residential and non-residential construction then cannot take place. As noted here, shortfalls in recoveries needed to support development will have implications either for the timing of being able to proceed with infrastructure works or will be transferred to the tax base or user fees. So in the following slides, I'm going to address some specific topics pertaining to Bill 108. We do acknowledge the preservation of the treatment of hard services under the changes as an important feature of the proposals. So some comments on the proposed DCA changes. So the removal of some of the 10% statutory reductions under the proposals is welcomed. It does allow for greater cost recovery for categories that have long been seen by the municipal sector as more consistent with hard services. So that's the waste and ambulance services. There are some mixed opinions with respect to expanding the exemptions for secondary suites. So for example, Durham has built a form of this into our current DC bylaw already. Some of the concerns here, though, are to make sure that we have clarity. There are some creative housing types existing and likely to emerge, as Joe referenced, so clarity on how those would be handled is critical to make sure that we're all very clear on how cash flow would arise from those. With respect to removal of the soft services from the DCA, and if I may digress for a moment, those of you that represent local municipalities that typically have the bulk of soft services, this is a very critical issue for you to be aware of. So it allows municipalities to impose a community benefits charge under the Planning Act that Kathy had referenced. So the authority for those soft services under the development charges is eliminated. So the province has indicated that they will ensure municipal revenues are maintained. So that was echoed again by the minister yesterday. We have some concerns over how that is possible and how that would take place with what's being proposed. So very quickly, with respect to maintaining neutrality, for example, municipalities need to consider whether their historic investment in growth-related infrastructure is indicative of future requirements. Neutrality based on current DC collections may not be as relevant for municipalities about to embark on a high period of growth and may also impact those who've not maximized their DCs in all categories. So for example, if you've traditionally only charged a percentage of what you could have charged, you now may, those numbers as far as what your collections are being factored into some analysis. Some additional comments on those removals of soft services. So that CBC charge can't exceed the amount determined by a formula that's involving the application of a prescribed percentage to value of land. So that prescribed percentage has not been released yet. So there are concerns with respect to what that may look like. So for example, geographic differences. If it's 1% on value of land, those of you in areas that have lower land values are going to collect proportionally less money than a municipality that has high land values, but you're likely still going to spend very similar on constructing the facilities that you're constructing. Different land uses is a question. Should there be differences between what's charged for residential versus non-residential? In my scenario, there's the allocation between upper and lower tier. If there is one cap, is there some understanding of how that cap would be allocated or determined? And then as a last note particular to that is what about land value changes? So some of you may not be in municipalities where the land values continue to appreciate. So if you would have less cash flow in declining markets, even though your costs may remain the same. There are some also questions around the land appraisal process and what that looks like. Again, with respect to those removal of soft services, there is a technical committee noted on the slide here. It does include municipal representation. Another item of note with respect to removal of soft services, there are exemptions included in the proposals. So clarity of those applications will be critical when we deal with exempt applications. So for example, when we talk about long-term care homes, I understand informally that the exemption for long-term care homes will likely include for-profit, not just non-profit long-term care homes, because the province has multiple partners in service delivery in that area and have their objectives around that. I'm not sure, for example, whether that's also true for retirement homes, whether profit retirement homes would also be eligible or if it's only nonprofit. So the definitions, the more broader the exemptions, the potential greater challenge in achieving that neutrality. So the definitions are very important to us. So services not currently eligible for DC funding are also ineligible for CBC funding. There was a concern with respect to the items that were listed in the draft proposals. I've had some recent discussions. It does appear that if it's currently an eligible service, as long as it can be defended as growth-related, it would still be eligible for CBC. So the list that was referenced originally only included a number of categories, and some of us had great concern over whether that was an exhaustive list, and apparently is not. The final bullet is critical for those of you who are planning a significant investment several years into the future. There is the reference that 60% of funds must be spent or allocated annually. Municipalities need the ability to use effective financial planning tools to minimize debt. You need to be able to accumulate some funds to deal with those large infrastructure. With respect to collection of development charges, so this is another new component. Development charge deferrals are now available, or will be available, starting from occupancy. So right now, development charges are paid upon building permit. There's also installments that are going to be available. So for example, rental housing and industrial institutional commercial developments are now being proposed to have a 5-year, so it would be 6 years of installments. Nonprofit housing is 20 years, so 21 years of installments. On the positive side, municipalities can charge interest. We do have, again, some concerns. So rental and nonprofit housing, for example, if they're going to get a deferral, we would like that to make sure that you have to maintain that rental or nonprofit status during the duration of that deferral. Other definitions of concern, so under institutional, this is just an example for those of you that have post-secondary. Should this deferral be only for the academic space? The post-secondary have had to become very creative over revenue generation and have a lot of public-private partnerships for residence space, for example. They all have Starbucks and Tim Hortons in their main areas. So, definitions will be critical with respect to how much is permitted under this category. And the last reference I'll make is concerns with respect to ownership. So if you have DCs outstanding for 20, 21 years, as we all know, property ownership changes on a very regular basis. So for your administrative side of your staff, trying to track these to collect the payments every single year during that duration could perhaps be quite a burdensome challenge. And while I'm at the upper tier, I recognize in most cases it's the local level that does the collections on our behalf. So there's a lot of work for the local municipalities to address that. So this would result, all told, in some reduced cash flow. So that could impact the timing of your projects, particularly in the early years. Year 1, you're going to get 1/5 or 1/6. Year 2, you'll get another 1/5 or 1/6. So those first 6 years, it will take a while till you get, the full cash flow flowing through that process. The next issue is freezing of development charges. So they are going to be frozen for 2 years after approval of the site plan or zoning bylaw application. Again, municipalities can charge interest, but there is a potential of lost revenue if the indexing that we do today doesn't quite match up with the interest that you can prescribe. The greatest risk of loss here, though, I would suggest, is when a new DC bylaw is adopted, because that often picks up what I call system shocks that aren't normally covered off in indexing. So every now and then, for example, there will be a big shock to the cost of steel. A number of years back, we issued a tender for a recreation facility, and it came in substantial beyond what anybody had anticipated because there was a recent shock at that point in time with steel prices. So those are the ones that would be tough to pick up in an interest rate environment. Some transition, I've almost made my way through all this detail. Some transition, the proposed transition is by January 1st, 2021. So over 200 municipalities may need to implement a CBC. The proposal is that you would continue to collect for soft services under your DC until the earlier of when you do that new bylaw or this January 1st, 2021. The most significant request that certainly from my perspective I'd make is that this process not be rushed. I appreciate timing is everything, but this is a significant change to funding of infrastructure, and we'd like to avoid as many unintended consequences as possible. So we want to ensure there's the opportunity to do significant modeling once those caps are proposed and other items are clarified. This would be benefit to all parties because it would significantly impact municipal finances, but it also would impact the province's objectives going forward around housing supply and the development community's ability to move forward. So even when we have final information to get 200 municipalities to revamp all of those processes, could take about 18 months to get all your bylaws into place. So next steps, there are more detailed regulations to follow. So as promised by the minister, they do suggest that changes are supposed to maintain revenue neutral for the municipalities. Critical to some of us in very high growth areas is ensuring previously executed front-ending and cost-sharing arrangements between developers and municipalities are maintained. It's important as well, there's a survey that's just been released with respect to parkland dedication and Section 37 density bonusing. It's critical if those of you have any influence to get those submitted as soon as possible, because the province is going to make decisions based on the accuracy of the data they have. And if we don't give them that accurate data, we would essentially live with the consequences of that. So if you could please provide comments at every stage of the consultation process, because each municipality is different and may be affected to a different degree based on all these proposals. So a quick example of that, at the upper tier, I'm likely more concerned with the deferrals and timing of payments. The local level, where you have a lot, perhaps on that CBC side of it, you might be very, very concerned over what that cap looks like. If you have a high debt load for growth and you're looking at issuing another more high debt for growth, you need to make sure that that cap can cover off those commitments, plus presumably give you flexibility for other growth-related soft services. So, it's important that don't rely on one municipality to provide comments. If you can all provide comments, it's important because you all will have a very different perspective on what may occur to you in your home municipalities. So thank you very much. I appreciate your time.
Jody is Acting Director, Legal Services in the Legislative and Planning Services Division of Halton Region. She's practiced there since 2018 and previously was a partner with Aird and Burles LLP in Toronto, practicing in the area of municipal and land use planning law. Jody articled at the City of Windsor, and prior to attending law school, she was a municipal advisor with the Sudbury Municipal Services Office of the Ministry of Municipal Affairs and Housing. She spent 5 years as CAO clerk of the municipality of French River. Jody received her BA from Laurentian University in Sudbury and holds a Master of Public Administration in Local Government from the University of Western Ontario. She completed her LLB at the University of Windsor Law School. She is past president of the UWO Local Government Program Alumni Society and has taught municipal law at Windsor Law and land use planning law at Ryerson's Urban Planning School. You've been busy. She's been a panelist on Roma Question Box panel for the last 6 years, and Jody is currently a board member of the Canadian Mental Health Association Halton branch. Welcome, Jody.
Good morning, and thank you for having me here, and thank you, Karen, for welcoming me to the panel. I really appreciate it. I'm bringing a little bit of a different perspective than the rest of the panel, because I am looking at it from a few different lenses. I'm not a land use planner, I'm not an economist, I'm not a treasurer, but I, as you've heard, have a sort of a wide variety of a background perspective to bring to this. So I wanted to talk about a few different topics as we move forward into our discussion panel today. And the first thing I wanted to talk about is what I call opportunities and challenges. And we've heard some of those from both Nancy and Joe earlier, and I hope to contribute to that. There are many different views and interpretations about what the impact of the legislative changes in the provincial policy direction will mean. We won't truly know until the regulations are in place and the changes are implemented on the ground, and frankly, until we've had some appeals and challenges and the legislation is interpreted. So I get to give you my favorite lawyer answer today. What does all of this mean? It depends. But with any change, there are opportunities and challenges for everybody involved. One of the real opportunities is an opportunity for dialogue. And you heard that yesterday from the minister, talking about consultation and the discussions with the AMO MOU tables, with the technical working groups, and with the industry associations. So having that dialogue is something that is valuable to all. We can all bring our different perspectives, and that discussion in forums such as this and within our communities and all of our stakeholders is really important. I'm not intending to get into the merits of any of the specific items in detail, and Kathy gave a good overview of the highlights of the legislative changes. But what rather I want to do is provide some comments from my perspective. The outlined purpose and intent of the bill is laudable. It is one of those big, broad statements that I think anybody would have any difficulty disagreeing with. It's hard to argue with the idea that it should take a reasonable amount of time to get homes of a wide variety built with certainty of cost input so that everyone in our communities have a variety of available housing choices. That is a big, broad goal, and I find it hard to argue with the idea. A couple of things are hard for me to reconcile about that, though. Looking at the legislative framework and the proposed changes and the changes that we'll see coming with the regulations and the transition and implementation guidelines, is trying to reconcile the ideas that municipalities that I've heard and read in some of the analysis along the way, that municipalities are a roadblock in the process, both in terms of time and cost. Some of what I've heard and seen and read seems to be at odds maybe a little bit with the idea of the MOU, with the idea that municipalities are accountable and mature levels of government. Looking at that alongside with the concept in the legislation, that seems to indicate to me municipalities need oversight and supervision on land use and financial planning matters. So thinking about that and having that dialogue, thank you, is something that we want to think about. In my community, in Halton Region, we have long planned for housing supply to accommodate the region's vision for growth based on the provincial growth plan, based on the PPS, and we have official plan policies in place to ensure there's an adequate mix and a variety of housing that will satisfy a differing physical, social, and economic need from various components of the community. We also take great care to plan and finance the necessary infrastructure development to support this vision. And this kind of discussion involves what I call both big P planning and little p planning. And this necessarily involves strategic vision led by council and the councils of local municipalities where you're in a two-tier system. It involves community input. It involves input from residents and from development industry partners. It involves the development and implementation of master plans for infrastructure and community services, as well as related financial plans. This work necessarily involves a significant amount of time and resources. But it's important. It builds and it seeks to implement a community vision. And that's one of the things that I think about when I read the legislation and I think about the transition and the implementation is where is the role in all of this for community vision? It takes time and effort, and dare I say passion, to put an official plan into place. It doesn't get into place unless it meets a myriad of provincial requirements, unless it contains policies aligned with and are supportive of the provincial policy statements. Some of the changes made through Bill 108 might help protect this vision and give it time to be implemented, such as time limits on several types of appeals and who can appeal. But some of the concerns for me are some of the bill's provisions that might actually shake an official plan and its foundation. Some examples are the shorter processing time for applications. That time may not give professional staff adequate opportunity to fully evaluate the impact of proposed variations to the official plan. A concern I have is what I'll call the old basis for appeals, moving from just the consistency and conformity test in Bill 139 back to de novo hearings and back to the idea of what represents good planning. It could be argued that it will be easier to achieve amendments to plans, particularly as related to height and density under Bill 108, and that can shake the community vision that was developed in alignment with the provincial goals. I'm going to talk about appeals in a couple of minutes, but the return to the de novo hearing basis of appeals may actually add time and cost to the planning process, and that may result in significant variations from what was intended to be achieved as part of the community vision. And I'm not sure, I'm still struggling with the idea of how that practically aligns with the goal of getting a variety of housing to market faster and with more predictable cost. Another important aspect of planning, both big P and little p, is the alignment of infrastructure with the planning processes and ensuring that practical, achievable plans are in place so that growth pays for growth and that the maintenance of infrastructure is planned for. Achieving growth projections is dependent on delivering supporting infrastructure. And to me, it's not clear yet how shifting around the vehicles through which capital costs for both hard services and soft services are paid will bring a variety of housing to market faster and with more predictable cost. An important issue not addressed in the legislation for me is related to community infrastructure accompanying residential growth are the things that the province is responsible for putting in place to help support community vision. And these are things like ensuring school capacity is in place as residents arrive, healthcare infrastructure and capacity is aligned with residential growth, and provincial transportation networks have capacity to support residents and jobs. So these, from a little p planning perspective, are really important, but we have opportunity for dialogue with our industry sector partners, our communities, and the province. I wanted to spend my last couple of minutes giving you some of my thoughts on some of the practical implications of the legislation. And this, for me, necessarily turns to appeals and hearings, the good and the bad. First and foremost, as I mentioned before, I don't know how going back to de novo hearings is going to reduce the time or the cost involved in development approvals. Even though Bill 108 takes the steps to reduce the number of potential appellants on some matters, it does reopen, as I said, those broad categories for appeals. In addition, the reduced times for appealing non-decisions may actually increase the number of appeals or applications to the LPAT that take place. And once the appeals are filed, there's no guarantee at this point how quickly they'll move through the system in terms of the resourcing of the LPAT, the mandatory mediation process, and the scheduling of those hearings, as well as the practice we may see of modifications taking place that move us further from the community vision, and those take some time to bring forward and have for discussion. I give you an example, and it is under the former planning regime. We had an official plan in place in Halton, and it was ROPA 38 was the number. To take that through appeal was over $3.5 million in over 5 years. That's significant. There were a substantial number of appellants, and that is not likely going to happen under the Bill 108 regime anymore because of the reduction of the appeal rights for those kind of appeals. But appeals, there won't be appeals of a ministerial approved official plan, but my concern is if the minister makes modifications to what council puts in place, there's no ability for council to appeal, it would seem. So that too becomes a little bit of an issue. But again, there's going to be a potentially larger number of appellants because we may see this expanded ground of appeal. Whereas we might have reduced the appellants if it was just a consistency and conformity test, we've rebroadened that up. It's not just land use planning appeals, though, that are likely to cause time and expense. I just want to offer a caution that changes to the Development Charges Act and new DC bylaws being put into place may mean some appeals for calculation methodologies, but more importantly for new eligible items in terms of looking at the CBCs, which are not appealable to the LPAT, but we still may have appeals on the basis of included projects. One of my issues that I see is that the community benefits regime does not look to be appealable to the LPAT, but it doesn't mean there aren't going to be court challenges in the nature of judicial review or other types of application to court to challenge the reasonableness or the process involved in the community benefits bylaws. What I call the shifting of items between the DCA and the CBC, rather than collecting parkland contributions and Section 37 bonusing contributions, this may result in uncertainty and more difficulty for municipalities with carrying out integrated financial planning for growth-related items. There's a potential that one part of that regime could be challenged or appealed. And often you have to look at the entirety of the financial planning as one piece. And if either the CBC regime is challenged or the DC regime is challenged, and there are adjustments made to the rates, there could be a gap. And who's left dealing with the gap and funding the gap? So that's something that is a concern that we might want to think about. Again, I'm not clear in my mind yet how all of these items will help ensure a variety of housing is available in a timely and cost-effective way. If the goal is for all Ontarians to find a home that meets their need and their budget, I think we need to continue having the discussion between all stakeholders, the province, all of our municipalities, and our development community. And that can start today with our moderated discussion, and again after this conference, and we all go back to our communities and continue the conversations. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Jody. As you see, this is a very well-chosen panel. We've sort of covered the waterfront. The first question I'm going to ask Nancy to start off with, and that's, what does growth pays for growth mean from your perspective?
As indicated by some of the audience response to that, I think many of you are already aware of that, what my answer will be from a municipal finance perspective. the concept of growth paying for growth means that any costs that related and are required to bring those growth-related, whether it be residential, non-residential, on stream, should be covered through the growth development process, not transferred to the property tax base that we all challenge ourselves with trying to maintain fiscal responsibility there.
Jody, you look like you'd like to comment.
Sure, thank you very much. I agree. I mean, growth pays for growth, from my perspective, means that we should ensure that all growth-related costs are borne to the development that created the need for those services, and those costs should not be borne by existing taxpayers. And an example from my community, the annual cost of growth to the region that cannot be collected under the DCA because of the exemptions and the various policy requirements is about $14.1 million a year. And when you combine that with the same shortfalls for our lower tier municipalities, Burlington, Oakville, Halton Hills, and Milton, and with the school board, the annual cost is just over $87 million a year. So I don't know how that is going to carry forward. Are we going to be expected to carry the same shortfall as municipalities when I hear the province saying we don't anticipate there to be any loss of revenue? We already have loss of revenue under the policy regime, so I'm not certain if that's intended to continue at that level.
Joe, from the home builders' perspective?
So this is why I was invited on this panel. to be provocative and speak to this issue. So let me start with this. Representing the industry, speaking to our membership, we support the principle of growth pays for growth. I think the issue here is, what does that concept really mean? We spend a lot of time talking about individual silos. The DC functions this way. We see it, my colleagues see it as a shortfall because this isn't covered. Parkland pays for this. There's a shortfall. We see it this way. We have these very siloed discussions that end up in a math equation with a number at the back end that says we're short whatever the number is. I respect that perspective. I understand where it's coming from. That's the work you're asked to do. What does growth mean when you say growth pays for growth? When a new home purchaser purchases that house, built into the price of that house is not simply the development charge for the hard infrastructure, it's a contribution for local school, community centers, recreational centers. They're even paying for that tree being planted on the front lawn. Within that price is the HST, is the GST. There are many things within that price which is a growth paying for growth equation. That's how we see it from this perspective. And at the end of the day, what we're looking back to is say, can you justify a $100,000 growth pays for growth charge? Can you justify a $150,000, a $200,000? Can you justify that within the price? Absolutely. There is math to justify it. But you're kind of missing the forest for the trees. All those things add up to this question. If you come up with a charge, whatever that charge is, and suddenly that development cannot move forward, have you responded to the other question? How is your community providing housing opportunities? I think that's where we come from this perspective and say, why don't you put all the math together and have a complete consideration for all those pieces? Now, I know I'll get back. I'll get back. The difference is covered by the taxpayer. I know I'll get that back. But I think part of this is going to be the conversation around having a better sense of what does it mean growth pays for growth? And what are all the different tools and what's the transition look like? We're now in a new regime. There's going to be lots more discussion around this. The idea of connecting a community benefit charge to the land value with a cap system, that concept comes from an idea of there needs to be some cost certainty because housing is only coming forward if developers put forward applications and bring those projects forward. 95% of housing built in this province is built by the private sector. So this is all how this thing has to work together in partnership. I think at some point we have to move beyond the silo discussions and we have to get into the broader conversation, which is why I always start with the polling information, what you hear on the campaign trail, home believer, vision and views, and really, how do we move this thing forward? That's how I look at it. So does growth pay for growth? If you look at it all, not just a DC, a Parkland charge, and all the rest of it, if you look at it all, there's lots of money being built into the price of a home that goes into government services. Where's it going? How's it being allocated? The challenge is it gets cut up 4 or 5 different ways into 4 or 5 different envelopes. I'm hopeful that a move to a community benefit charge provides a big enough bucket that as a municipality, when you get that money, you can make those priorities and move those things forward. So my response is the principle stays. It needs to be dealt with. It's a cornerstone of what we need to do to bring projects forward. My perspective, does growth pay for growth? When you look at the whole system, it absolutely does. In the new system, will it pay for growth again? It absolutely must. Because without that, things are not going to move forward. No applause for the developer.
Nancy or Jody, do you want to jump in? You don't have to. Okay. Somebody's heckling you. What about hospitals? But Joe, I'm going to keep you on the hot seat here and have you start off with the next question, which is, what is causing housing costs to increase? Is it inputs, land values, fees, market forces?
Well, I mean, the first thing is you have overwhelming demand. That's the reality in the marketplace. But I think, you know, when I speak to the members, and again, I'm not a developer, but I work for the members, they have to put together a project, not only working through the regulatory regime and finding certainty about when am I going to get an approval or a decision, they've got to put together the finances. All these things come together. So when we talk about inputs, when we talk about regulatory regime, the demand, supply chain realities, it's all driving a cost structure. And then the other side of it is, it's a marketplace. And if our regulatory regime cannot respond to a market demand, I always go back to the example of widgets. If everybody needs a widget, but only one person can build the widget, that widget becomes very valuable in a market environment. That's just the reality. Look, builders can't build without an approval. They need the approval, they need the partnership. So I think it's important that regulators, wherever they're coming from, provincial, municipal, understand that if we have a functional regulatory market, if there's cost certainty, we can get product to market, it will help the affordability. That's our perspective. So the drive right now is because there are, as you saw from CMHC's presentation, there are regulatory burdens. There are infrastructure challenges. And the driving point of all that is that it drives up so that whatever product can get to market gets priced to the market. So let's work on the regulatory framework. Let's find a way to make the market more functional. You know, it's interesting, I always say this. I'm sitting here as an industry association spokesperson for an industry that wants to put more supply on the market. How many companies want more supply of the product in the market? Not many. But we're standing here as OSBA saying, we want to get more supply in the market. We want to open up more choice and more opportunities, more supply. Our expectation is it will create better affordability. Very few industries take that approach. They take the other approach. How can we restrict the market so we're the only game in town? That's not where we're coming from. We don't think that's good public policy. We think that's the approach to taking forward. More choice, more housing, more supply.
Jody, do you want to comment?
I think so, and I think that in looking at the issue of what is dealing, you know, what is causing some of that particular issue, and looking at what goes into that, it is a large part the market forces and the supply and demand. But one of the categories that you mentioned in that was the idea of municipal fees as well, and that cost certainty is important. And municipal fees and charges generally are predictable. And from what we've seen, they have a negligible impact on the overall housing price. DCs have generally been consistent, about 5 to 7% of new home cost over the past sort of life of the Development Charges Act and its permeation. So that is fairly predictable. I appreciate maybe we'd have a different discussion about Section 37, depending on where in the province you are. But from the perspective of development charges and the financing of infrastructure, other than sort of the 5-year DC bylaw update and the opportunity for appeals, there has been a general consistency. I think in terms of supply, and I appreciate your comments that you say, you know, that your industry and your members want to increase supply. Obviously, they're in the business of building homes. They want to build homes. But I think one of the things to look at with that is municipalities also have a vision for their communities, and I alluded to that's the whole point of the lengthy official plan process, with public consultation, with input, then with whatever level of approval is necessary, whether it's a local OP being approved by the upper tier or ministerial approval where that's required. And when we see the cost and time involved in an appeal to vary that plan, that can add to the price as well, I would think. That would potentially impact it. Maybe part of a pro forma, maybe something you build in as a contingency. But that's one piece of advice I have for municipalities. If you don't already, have a bit of an understanding about what goes into the makeup of one of your members' projects and how those projects are financed. To educate yourself a little bit about that. That may be helpful in terms of opening some of that conversation. But understanding the components of the pricing and the cost. And I don't know, Joe, how the sort of cost of an eventual appeal, particularly when you get into a multi-year, multi-expert, multi-party appeal, that too necessarily, I would imagine, has an impact on the overall market price of the home that's being built in the development.
So, Nancy, Jody practically jumped on this next question, so I'm going to pose it to you. We're in the formulative stages of the new community benefit charges and development regime. What's the one piece of advice that you would give people working on that project?
So if I may, I'm going to echo part of the comments from my presentation. We need time. I appreciate there's a housing crunch, absolutely, and certainly the representatives in the room that knock on doors understand what that means. But there are a significant number of unintended consequences that could occur. We're down this pathway. We have assurances that there will be revenue neutrality, but the implications in making sure that that actually occurs, we need time to make sure that that's actually going to be what hits the street at the end of the day, and that for the sector of the multi-tier governments that only get 9 cents of the tax dollar, we need to be very careful to make sure that what we are doing is balanced. We want to contribute to the conversation significantly, but we need to make sure that the time is taken to make sure all those consequences for the significant variation of how it can impact municipalities, we are not one size fits all. It's incredibly dramatic, the implications from one municipality to another.
Jody?
Yeah, I think I echo a little bit of that. I think taking the time and making sure that the drafting is right for the regulations and for the any transitional provisions is going to be key. I mean, heaven knows, I love to go to court and argue about statutory interpretation, and at the end of the day,
Don't we all?
so much fun. But at the end of the day, that may be how some of this gets interpreted. And the clearer the drafting is, the less opportunity there is for challenge that impacts us all in getting this vision implemented and getting housing with choice put in place in all of our communities. I think for me, the one tip, though, that I'd have for those putting this project into place and bringing forward the regulations and the transition provisions is to think about the gap that I mentioned in my remarks. If there's an appeal or a challenge to one aspect of the financing regime, whether it's the development charge or the community benefits charge, think about the gap and what happens if through that challenge or appeal there's a reduction or a change in the charge. What happens to the other one? Is there a necessary re-examination to make sure that we filled in a gap and that we aren't left with municipalities scrambling that can lead to slowing down the process as well. So making sure we get that piece right.
Joe, do you have any advice as we look forward at confirming this regime and looking at the regulations for the community benefit charge?
I mean, I've had members who are concerned about the change in the context of the commitment that the monies raised in that go to make those community improvements, go towards the parks, the daycare centers, and things that help build out a complete community. And so I've had those concerns. I've had the other concerns that say, look, the municipality is going to set their priorities. The certainty of the number provides clarity on the developer side. The certainty of the number also provides clarity on the municipal side. You know exactly what you have to work with early enough in the process that you can set your priorities appropriately. One of the challenges we have, and just building off some of the comments here is this. Look, municipal council is empowered by their elected representatives, and you are empowered by your communities. And your community vision, whatever that campaign turns into, has a direct impact on how the community is going to grow. And this is a classic conversation that we have around NIMBYism. What does it look like? How does it function? What does it mean? We've seen many, many OPs in the last 10 years, which started in one place and was working in that direction at the end of an election with a new council, empowered by their constituents to say, no, we don't support that community vision any longer. Let's shut it down. That's really, really painful from a developer perspective if you've invested in that vision and you're working through that vision. So when we talk about the sanctity of OPs and community vision, we should also have a better understanding of, because I worked for elected representatives in my past life, I respect that reality. You were elected to present this vision. However, there is a framework. Things have been working in this direction. And so developers sometimes get caught in this sort of, well, we're not going there anymore. Okay, we've been elected to do this. All right, we're going to make these changes. Okay, well, we need to challenge those changes. And we need to know that there's a third party, tribunal of some sort, that can challenge and have a discussion around the policies, provincial and locally, and where they go. That's part of our reality, too, in this equation. So when you talk about the cost of an appeal, sometimes the cost of the appeal is to secure the provincial piece to the municipal piece. It's to secure what infrastructure are we really talking about that needs to be built. It's to secure all those pieces. It's painful. It is extremely painful. It's expensive. But sometimes the fight is worth the fight to get that clarity moving forward, to set things in motion so we know where we're going for the next 20 years. That's just the reality. And unfortunately, when you want to work in a collaborative environment, those appeals break down relationships, and you end up in a conversation that becomes very siloed about this charge, this development, this building, that cladding. It just runs into a really difficult space. So I want to bring it back to where we need to be. What are we doing to bring more housing to your communities? What does that look like? The province has a vision in place. I mean, the growth plan was brought forward in 2003. It's about intensification. It's about transit-focused development. All of the municipal pieces that have run into that have found a way to work through that, identify the infrastructure necessary, establish the standard of service you want to have, and work through that. There's nothing wrong with challenging those pieces. And so we'll work through that process moving forward. But, you know, I have full respect and appreciation for where municipal council comes from, the authority you have, the issues you need to raise, and the direction you need to give staff. On this side of the equation, that's why we need a tribunal. And that's why we need a tribunal that functions in an environment where evidence is valued to respond to the issues at hand. And so de novo becomes part of that conversation. The ability to bring forward evidence when it's time to go to the tribunal. And so I think that's part of the conversation, and it's painful. No one's happy about it. And so the winners in all this will be the lawyers. They'll be the winners in all this. And the experts. They'll be the winners in all this, which is why I think it's even more important that we work together to figure out what's the direction, the use of mediation to deal with these issues.
So I'm about to galvanize this panel, and they're all going to hate me because I'm going to go off script, and I'm going to go pick up on the point that Joe just made, and I'm going to ask you, how do we look at different forms of housing? I mean, we're talking, you referenced official plans changing over time. We know the immediacy of housing needs right across our province. We know that there are new forms, so whether we're looking at tiny houses, co-housing, secondary units, what are some of the challenges that you see when we're going into an entirely new area, an innovation that necessarily has not been part of our history?
So let me take a moment to pick on our friends from Toronto for a second. So Toronto started a conversation around laneway houses 12, 15 years ago. And we engaged in that conversation. We said, this is a great idea. Take full advantage. New housing option, let's go. And we were brought in, we did some research, we did some studies. We brought members in who were interested in bringing that format forward. 2 councillors took it on as a challenge to bring it forward in their wards. The process to get laneway housing approved across the city of Toronto, that's a 10-year-old process, 5 years through council. What we thought was a simple conversation around adding a simple idea, not even a new idea, because coach housing has been, it's part of Toronto's history. It took that long, and it took that long because, again, council needs to work through a process and get to the end point. So what we struggle with is even when we agree on a form of housing, secondary suites, for example, simple idea, it makes sense. The pain of getting it through a regulatory process is extremely painful. We see all sorts of new housing ideas coming forward. We need champions on council to bring those forward. Because the reality is when a developer brings forward a new housing idea, the first question brought forward by council is, well, how much are you going to make off that idea? Well, it's still an idea that's going to work in your community. Yeah, but walk me through your pro forma. What's it look like? For a developer, that's not the conversation we want to start with. This is a new form of housing. Does it work in community? What do you think? Laneway housing works in Toronto, great. How many conversations did I have with counselors around, okay, but you're gonna make a lot of money off this idea, right? Is that the conversation we need to have? The conversation we need to have is, does it work in your community? Yes. Can you make it as regulatorily simple as possible? There should be no pain in this conversation. Yes, great. Now we'll see the innovation. Let people come in and make it happen. That's our view. So we need champions. Tiny homes is a great idea. It's tough pickup. Like there are municipalities who simply want nothing to do with it. It doesn't function for them. Great. It's a great idea. So innovation is a challenge. We need champions.
Jody, you look ready to jump in.
Well, I don't disagree. Any change, brings out questions and concerns, and brings out concern not just between a developer and a council, but also a community. Sometimes, particularly when you look at things like co-housing and secondary suites, there's a little bit of a suspicion or an information gap perhaps in some of our communities, and some of the dialogue that maybe needs to happen at the community level about what is it we want, what is it we're concerned about, and how can we overcome some of those to provide some of those options, maybe as part of the community conversation and dialogue when we're making new plans. But there are some other partners that we want to think about with some of these challenges. There's a certain magazine in Toronto that recently their cover featured, modular homes and sort of shipping container homes, which was I picked it up because of that. It was quite interesting. But when I think about some of the difficulties perhaps with mortgages and financing and appraisals of these kind of properties and what banks are thinking about them, I think about building codes and what changes may be required to building codes and to education of building officials with respect to these homes. It's more than just a development partner and a council that are part of that conversation. So I think if that's something in your community that you're seriously thinking about in terms of a variety of options, maybe start by having some of those conversations as well. That might be something we all would be advised to think about doing.
I didn't see that magazine, but I do watch HGTV, and I've seen them on there. Nancy, do you want to add to this conversation?
I think the only thing more from a granular perspective that I would add is that I made a quick reference to this. I think there's going to need to be a lot of creativity if we are going to try to address this problem. And from a granular perspective, from municipal finance, we want to make sure that whatever is addressed gives us the flexibility to handle that, so that we're not back around arguing over how we're going to apply all of these things based on the rules that are written down. So I think creativity is critical in solving the problem, but we need to make sure that we're anticipating creativity and figure out a way to address it.
I want to thank you on behalf of everyone here that's in the audience and watching through the video and taping of this for your really insightful input, and offer each of you a last word if you want to have it. And I think we'll start with Joe, because you got the first word, and we'll come back this way. I can keep talking if you want to gather your thoughts.
I just want to thank AMO for inviting me to be here. When we were prepping for this, I had a sense that the developer voice would be the different voice on the table. I think that's true. I want to leave you with this point. Housing is a top issue of mind across the country, municipally, provincially, federally. Make no mistake, we need to work together. Fundamentally, at the end of the day, more housing supply, more choice in the marketplace will lead to better affordability across the board. So thank you for your time.
Nancy.
The only closing comment I would make is to please pay attention. We very, very much need all of you to look at how this impacts your municipalities and submit comments and submit opinions, because it is very different for all of us. And if this is the template going forward, this is our municipal financial scheme to deal with all of these issues, so we need to get it right.
Jody.
And thank you. And first of all, have the conversations, have the dialogue with your development community, have the dialogue with the province, participate in those input opportunities. But more importantly, if you're going to take one thing back to your municipality from today, go back and talk to your staff and have conversations amongst yourselves as council about where you're at in terms of thinking about implementation. I know this is new legislation and we're still waiting for regulations, but the times will come quickly. I don't have a sense that we're going to see a bunch of extensions on implementation timelines for these things, and there's a lot of moving parts. So have those conversations about what you're doing in your communities to be able to hit the ground running with some of these items.
Thank you again. To be respectful of everybody's time, we've run out the clock. I see one brave soul at the mic, so we will take your question after we conclude. So again, thank you all for coming, and thank you for a very stimulating conversation.
Okay, we are on a schedule here, so we're trying to get everything wrapped up, and I do have a few final closing remarks. Just remember, you have to be in the room to win the prize, and all of the cards are over here, so if you can just give me a couple of minutes to do the wrap-up thank yous, then we will have the draw. It's certainly good to see the number of you here today. It's very much appreciated. It was great to see the number of provincial MPPs and staff, and certainly federal MPs and staff as well. We have to thank our 37 sponsors. Again, to each and every one of you, thank you, and we look forward to welcoming you back next year. We also want to thank the more than 100 exhibitors and the speakers, moderators, and I also want to thank our board as well, the AMO board, for their efforts. Our youth engagement got off to a good start with $4,600, so save your pennies for next year. And the prizes were wonderful, and I want to thank the board members for donating them. I want to give a shout out to Marty and the AV team. Thank you. It's absolutely amazing what goes on behind there and back there and everything else. So it's really, really special. I also want to thank Poonam and Victoria. If they're out here somewhere, thank you very much. They do the logistics, and you were absolutely amazing. And to the AMO staff, both here and at the office in Toronto. It takes a team to build this program. Topics, speakers, and the on-site flow, thank you very much. Please give them a round of applause. A conference evaluation will be sent out soon, so certainly when you get that, please fill it in. Give us your feedback, because we will be planning very soon for 2020. To the delegates for attending the conference, thank you very much. Hopefully you found it worthwhile. I've had some great comments over the last few days. Again, fill out those evaluation forms, but thank you very much for attending and being here and making this event special. Before I finally wrap up, Pat, thank you. I can't go without not saying it. Thank you. And we wish you all the best. And Brian, please stand up so everybody knows who you are. I think they probably do, but as of September 1st, thank you. So, again, thank you, everyone. And let's see here. So remember, we have to be here to win. Sandra Clancy. No? Okay. Was she here and left? Cheryl Fort. So, Cheryl. Congratulations, Cheryl. Everyone have safe travels. Thank you. See you next year.
fell and lost to the war. Shot me dead. I was lost and I said to the voices in my head, I'm gonna